Oh, hello everyone out there, and welcome to the Sunday stream of Adam's Music Box. And I won't pretend that this is going to be a particularly happy episode, because as I alluded to a few weeks ago when we were talking about Pink Floyd's The Wall, some very terrible things are happening in the world right now, particularly the ancient Christian communities of the Levant and Syria in particular are facing hardship and things much worse than that. We don't need to be explicit about it because if you want to know the dangers facing these holy, innocent, kind people in their villages and their homes, then you already know. And in a time like this, the best thing and the only thing you can really do foremostly is to pray. But there's also the world around us, and we need other things to fill our eyes and to, more importantly, in this case, fill our ears. And that's why on this episode, I want to talk about the kinds of music that I, in any case, play when thinking about grief or when actually grieving. And there was a lot of sorrow felt over the last 24 hours. And as all of the horror was unfolding on the screen in front of me, I started to play some music. And I want to tell you what I played to console and to validate. That's probably not the right word, but to bring some level of commiseration, if you will, emotional commiseration to the grief that one felt. So without further ado, the first piece of grief that I played was the Sixth Symphony of Tchaikovsky, the Pathetique. Now, this was the final piece that Tchaikovsky completed in his lifetime. Some have referred to it as a kind of elegy for himself. It's very mournful in many ways, a beautiful symphony with many classic Tchaikovskyan melody lines, but uniquely, it's a symphony that ends with a whimper, which is something very unique for Tchaikovsky and something unique for romantic symphonies of the era. Most of the time, these symphonies had a coda at the end of the fourth movement that was very bold or triumphant or stirring or vigorous. Tchaikovsky ends his piece with a very pronounced diminuendo that gets quieter and quieter and quieter. And it's not easy as an orchestra to play that convincingly, because however hard it might be to play with a high dynamic, a loud volume, fortissimo, convincingly, it's that much harder to retain the full sound, the full timbre of the tone when you're playing at quadruple pianissimo, the quietest, of the quiet. And so good orchestras with good conductors are able to achieve that. And the one I happened to listen to last night is one of my very favorites. It's a recording of the conductor Wilhelm Mengelberg and his Concertgebouw Orchestra. He recorded the piece several times. Other great recordings of the piece include Nikolai Golovanov, Wilhelm Furtwängler, and Herbert von Karajan, to name just a few. Maravinsky also did a very well-known and well-loved recording, as did Kusevitsky, who was well-known in Boston in the 30s and 40s. Now, that piece is one that takes you on a sort of emotional roller coaster. The first movement in itself is kind of like a symphonic poem, both in length and in scope. The fourth movement, though, is where it really all comes to a head. After a sort of meditative second movement and a very vigorous third movement, the final movement is one that is just very stirring because it's very unusual for Tchaikovsky to have such a kind of slow and muted final movement. His concluding movements to pieces are usually, very, full bodied, full bore. This was very different, and he did so consciously. He made the decision to do something different as though he knew he was saying goodbye. Other great symphonies from this late Romantic period are the seventh and eighth of Bruckner, and in particular, the second movement of the seventh symphony, the Adagio, and the third movement of the eighth symphony, another Adagio, have been used in funereal and mournful contexts because even though Bruckner's symphonies were not programmatic, they didn't have a specific theme, they had a very real and very convincing and very very cohesive expressive emotional palette with which the composer painted. And that second movement of the seventh and the third movement of the eighth are really heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching. I frankly, if you have the time, because Bruckner's symphonies, among other things, are very, very long, I definitely recommend that you listen to both those symphonies in total. In fact, I recommend that you listen to all of Bruckner's symphonies because they are all really good. My favorite Bruckner conductor, again, Furtwängler, who recorded all of the main symphonies. Hermann Abendroth also did a great job with Bruckner, as did Hans Knappertsbusch, as did Herbert von Karajan. With any of those conductors, you can't really go wrong, and you can go right. Another piece from a similar era that is very moving is a piece that Johannes Brahms wrote for his mother when she died. And this was his German Requiem, Ein Deutsches Requiem. And this was unique in that it was a requiem that followed the traditional liturgical form, but it was at face value a secular piece written in a vernacular language at a time when most composers in Catholic countries, or at least partly Catholic countries, would have composed the lyrics, would have used the Latin, obviously the Latin liturgical words. This, though, was sung in German, which had a very personal meaning for his mother and his family, because obviously it could be readily understood by everyone in the audience at that time. Such a fine piece of music. The second movement in particular, if you only have time to listen to one, really one of the most beautiful things ever written. So I would definitely recommend that. And the recordings that Furtwängler, again, my favorite, but also Mengelberg. It's both approach the piece very differently, but both equally good. So definitely check that out. So the other piece that I listened to was Tod und Verklärung, Death and Transfiguration, by Richard Strauss. One of the finest pieces on this subject ever, and it's one that, even though it has mournful passages, it ends on an optimistic note, a heavenly note, if you will, this symphonic poem, this tone poem, as some call it. Of all of the pieces that I'm mentioning in this video, it's probably the most approachable because, one, it's the shortest, but it's also in many ways the most modern, but without being jarring or dissonant. It's very much part of the late Romantic tradition, but much of the chordal structures and harmonies that Strauss uses in the piece hint at something very modern, as though it could be written for a film in the late 20th, early 21st century, which isn't to say it's not sophisticated. It's a very sophisticated piece, but there's something about it that just speaks to one's soul so directly, while not attempting to create programmatic or lifelike musical images of these very abstract and meditative, mournful themes. So that's one that I definitely recommend. And the great recordings, obviously Strauss recorded it himself. He lived into the 20th century, and he did a couple recordings, both very good. Mengelberg's is fantastic, as is Furtwängler's. And so we come to the final piece that I listened to while contemplating all of the sorrows of the world that were unfolding, and how just weeks before Christmas, many Christians whose families and their legacies in their regions, their indigenous regions, date back to the time of Christ, how they're not going to have much of a Christmas, so it seems. And so the final piece of music I listened to was the final piece of music written by Richard Strauss. And this was his four lost songs, literally four final songs. And these were songs that were composed after the Second World War. And war is obviously hell. There are really no winners in any war. And the biggest losers of every war are, of course, the civilians that are caught in the crossfire. There's a wonderful line from my favorite film, Lawrence of Arabia. Robert Bolt wrote the screenplay for it. And the line is this: young men make war, and the virtues of war are the virtues of young men, courage and hope for the future. Then the old men come and make the peace, and the vices of peace are the vices of old men, mistrust and caution. And that was what that line just really gets to me, because it really does explain war, both in its idealized form, which is never truly realized, and in the cynical way that wars end. And if they can be ended with that kind of cynicism, why can't that cynicism just turn into pragmatism and end them before they begin? So the final piece then is the Four Lost Songs of Strauss. Now, Furtwängler led the premiere of this. Strauss was had died several years, or actually several months rather, before the premiere. It premiered not in Strauss's home country, but in England in the year 1950. The piece was composed, or the songs rather, were composed 2 years before that. And to me, this is the ultimate of all of the great pieces I mentioned. This one is definitely the ultimate. Full stop. It just really is. And I've got a comment from David Brown. Thanks for coming back. You were listening yesterday. Yeah. I don't usually do it, but I will for this one. I'll put some links in the description. Now, this one that I'm talking about, the Four Lost Songs, this recording is very out of print, but luckily someone's uploaded it to YouTube, so Um, I'll put that in the description below, along with, I guess, some Spotify links to the others. I see also, Dave, another comment there. I have go-to music if I want to cry. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So these last four songs are just, they're the kind of pieces that when you listen to them, the world sort of stands still. And all you can focus on is the singing, whether you understand the German lyrics or not. Luckily, German translates into English very well. And the author of the writer of the lyrics was none other than Hermann Hesse, a very well-known poet and author in his own right. And I'll just read you the final stanza of the final song that is performed in this cycle of four songs. I'll just read it to you. O vast tranquil peace, so deep in the afterglow, how weary we are of wandering, is this perhaps death? And if that's the sneak preview, you can imagine what it's like on the recording. The recording, as I said, which is out of print, but there is a version of it available on YouTube, which I'll put in the description below, along with Spotify links to the others. That recording, it was the first and the best of this piece. Christian Flagstad, the great soprano, provides vocals, and Furtwängler is leading what at the time was the very newly created Philharmonia Orchestra. So to recap on the video, the pieces that I listened to, one, it was the Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony No. 6, and I listened to Mengelberg's version. I listened to the second and third movements, respectively, of Bruckner's Seventh and Eighth Symphonies by Furtwängler. I listened to the German Requiem. I listened to both the Furtwängler and the Mengelberg version. I'll put both of those in the description below. I listened to Strauss conducting his own Tod und Verklärung, Death and Transfiguration, and I'll put the Mengelberg and Furtwängler versions there for you as well, because they're all equally good, and I wouldn't want to force myself to decide for you which one you might like the best. And then finally, I'll put the link from YouTube to the Four Lost Songs of Richard Strauss. Now, when we're talking about mournful music, I don't like to be biased to one genre or another. For whatever reason, I turned to sort of the romantic European classical school of music yesterday when watching these mournful and tragic events unfold. But every genre has its own, and I'm sure that I'll do some future videos on some bad occasions, I suppose, of the kinds of music from other genres that are real tear jerkers, if you will. So we'll do that. Hopefully, well, not hopefully in a way, because we don't want bad events to happen now, do we? But the world being what it is, I'm sure we'll do that. So this one is a bit shorter than usual. There's not an overarching theme, except that these just happen to be pieces that brought me calm and brought me strength while watching the horrors that are beyond any person like myself's control happening in other parts of the world. So we've got prayer, we've got music. Other people have other ways of dealing with these sorts of things. But since this is, after all, a musical show, these are the pieces of music. As always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care, one and all, as best you can. Bye-bye.